When my husband started scrolling through my phone, my heart stumbled, not because I feared some melodramatic unmasking, but because I knew which messages would surface, the ones I hadn't deleted. I reached to tug the phone from his hand, but he pulled back with a practiced motion and kept reading. I watched his face alter line by line, each notification tightening the skin around his eyes, and felt the scaffolding of my days give way in a breath's span. Yes, he would learn the truth now. Not the whole of it. His fingers shook as he flicked further, and I knew he was about to hit the message that would redraw the ground beneath us. The one that could close the book, or fold it into some knot no one could untie. The phone buzzed in his hand, a new banner rose onto the screen. I saw the color drain from his face when he read the sender's name. He froze. He didn't blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, the old habit when my nerves gather like moths around heat. My nerves braided with the dread of what I had already set in motion. I could hear his breathing from 2 meters away, the short, uneven pulls. This was what I had dreaded most. Because 3 months earlier I stepped across a line that changed the shape of every room in my house, and now, let me tell you how it truly happened. Before I reveal the secret I tried so carefully to keep, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and answer this: have you ever protected a truth with all your strength only to find that nothing, in the end, could keep it hidden? I did not set out to betray anyone. That's a sentence people say to comfort themselves, but for me it sits less like a defense and more like a description of texture, the way fabric looks smooth until you tilt it toward the window and see the tiny snags in the weave. My marriage was not a battlefield. It was a corridor lined with framed photographs and a runner rug that never wrinkled. We had a ritual of quiet dinners, of weekend lists on a notepad by the fridge, of shared calendars. It was not the absence of love that hollowed the days, it was the absence of touch, of the two hands reaching for the same object at once and laughing. I missed heat in the simple places. The brush of a shoulder while passing in a doorway. A palm resting, without purpose, on the small of my back. He, the young man you will want to classify and label, arrived because of practicalities. His apartment needed repairs, the contractor had opened walls and found a habit of leaks. My husband said yes to the temporary stay with the brisk generosity he uses for logistics, the same tone he employs for flights and insurance renewals. "It's just a few weeks," he said over coffee, staring past me toward the bay window that collects morning sun. "It will help him save on rent." He called him his grandson. Technically he is my husband's step-grandson, from a branch of family that grafted on long before I came along. What matters, he is 25, independent, and arrived with 2 duffel bags and a sketchbook so fat with paper it splayed open on its own. I set fresh sheets in the guest room and placed a glass carafe on the nightstand. It felt like staging a small hotel, except that the air held the smell of our life, cedar from the wardrobe, citrus from the cleaner I used on the windows. In the hallway mirror I caught my reflection adjusting the curtains and noticed how carefully I had chosen my blouse that morning. Soft blue. Not showy. But with the quiet satisfaction of something that fit well. That, too, is a truth I won't pretend away. I wanted to be seen. Not as a role, but as a person who still has edges and light. He arrived before noon on a Saturday. The doorbell's extra chime, the one that sometimes fails, worked that day and set the dog 2 houses down barking. When I opened the door, he smiled with the kind of unguarded ease that is almost painful to look at because of how rare it becomes with age. "Hi," he said, and the word felt like someone throwing open a window. He lifted one duffel as if it weighed nothing. His hair was still damp from the rain that had threaded itself through the morning. We ate an early lunch, eggs, toast, tomatoes, and made the small talk of courteous people adjusting to proximity. He asked if he could help with anything around the house, the question that young men pose when they have been raised by women who value a tidy kitchen and repaired hinges. "There's the garden," I said, and then corrected myself. Only if you want. He wanted. By afternoon his sneakers were dark with soil and he had found an old pair of work gloves in the garage. I watched him from the kitchen door as he bent to lift a cracked pot, the movement fluid, unself-conscious. My husband stood beside me, narrating the status of the repairs at the apartment and the contractor's excuses, and I nodded at the right moments, but my attention split into filaments, the sun on the hydrangeas, the angle of his shoulders, the steady hum of a neighbor's mower, the way my husband's voice kept to facts. The first evening felt like a borrowed summer camp. He sat on the floor in the living room, spread his sketchbook on the coffee table, and drew in quick strokes that gave shape to ordinary things: the fern by the window, the chipped handle of a mug, the slope of the dogwood outside. I asked, "Do you draw people?" and he shrugged in a way that could mean anything. "Sometimes," he said. My husband read the news on his tablet and laughed once at a headline, then apologized for the noise, as if his amusement were a spill to wipe up. When I stood to make tea, the young man lifted his head and said he would like peppermint if we had it. We did. I found the tin behind the black tea and wondered why I knew exactly where it was. I hardly ever drink peppermint myself. Perhaps I had been, without knowing it, preparing for company. There is a posture a house takes when it welcomes an extra heartbeat. Bowls migrate to lower shelves. Towels multiply on hooks. Chairs scrape back more often. I felt it by the second morning, when I woke earlier than usual and discovered that I had slept more deeply than in months. The guest room door was still closed. I carried a basket of laundry past it with the stealth of a thief avoiding a motion sensor. It struck me that I had begun to measure my movements against someone else's rest. In the kitchen I stood barefooted on the cool tiles and peeled oranges with the slow care of someone inventing a ritual. When he finally came down, hair tousled and t-shirt creased from sleep, he said, "That smells like Sundays," and for a second the remark felt intimate, though it was only about citrus. My husband left for work with a list of numbers to call and a remark about traffic on the bridge. The house shifted on its hinges again. It is astonishing how space changes shape when the person who commands it by habit leaves. The quiet was not the heavy absence I knew from other mornings. It was elastic, a silence we could press our fingers into. He asked if there was a hardware store nearby. He wanted to fix the loose board on the back steps, and I offered to drive. In the car, we filled the first minutes with practicalities. Then the talk turned. He told me about the job he does part-time, about the supervisor who wears cardigans in heat, about the corner coffee shop that spells his name wrong in a new way every week. I listened more closely than those facts deserved and found myself laughing at a description of a cat that guards a studio door like a director of admissions. At the store he compared screws as if they were gemstones, weighing each on his palm, and I felt the absurd tenderness that rises when someone pays ridiculous attention to a small task. On the way back he noticed that I kept touching the neckline of my blouse and asked if I was cold. "No," I said, and dropped my hand. The honesty I did not add. I was aware of myself down to the ring at my throat, as if the air had sharpened. We spent the afternoon on practical things. He fixed the step. I sorted books. He sharpened the kitchen knives. "This one has a better edge than it looks," he said, running the blade gently along the steel. I made soup. The radio played an old song my husband used to hum when we first married, and for a moment nostalgia tugged me by the sleeve, then it let go. The day folded into the blue of evening. At dinner my husband spoke about a colleague's retirement and the wine they served. I listened and asked the questions that keep a story moving. Where will the colleague go? How long was he there? And admired my own calm. The sunlight slid along the table's edge and landed in a thin stripe across my wrist. The young man glanced at that stripe, then back to his plate, and I felt a small, shocking jolt, being looked at as a person whose wrist can catch light. That night I lay awake long after the house quieted, the corridor a dark ribbon, the guest room door a square of deeper shadow. I tried to catalog what, exactly, had changed. Not facts. He lived with us, he helped with the garden, we bought screws. The change was in my attention, which used to be scattered, work, errands, my husband's careful routines, and now moved like a river through a narrowed channel. When I finally slept, I dreamed of washing a window and finding that the view outside had lengthened, as if the yard had pushed out its fences overnight. You might expect a dramatic pivot, but the truth is gentler and more dangerous. It was the second week before I realized we had begun to build a language of glances and pauses, a handful of phrases that meant more than they said. He would lift an eyebrow when the kettle shrieked, and I would snort because it did sound like panic. I would gesture to the garden, and he would follow without words. My husband, immersed in contracts and their anniversaries, remained kind in the ways he had always been. He bought the good olive oil, he filled the car with gas without mentioning it, he set the table in precise symmetry. It is cruel that virtue can be as blinding as vice. His steadiness made it easier to pretend that the current beneath the floorboards was my imagination. On a Friday, the mail brought a thick envelope addressed to me in a looping hand I didn't recognize. I slid it open with my thumbnail and found an invitation to a small exhibition downtown. A former colleague had included a note, "You always loved light. Come." I almost put it aside. Then I imagined standing in a white room, facing a frame. Instead of suppressing the image, I allowed it to grow petals. At dinner I mentioned the show. My husband checked his calendar, then shook his head. "That's the day of the audit," he said. He suggested I go alone. I said I might. From the end of the table the young man said nothing, but when we cleared plates, his shoulder brushed the doorframe as he stepped aside for me, and in that brief contact there was a question. It is easier, sometimes, to recognize the first moment when a line is not crossed than the many that lead to it. That night, as I folded napkins and smoothed them into the drawer, I understood that my life had tilted by half a degree, imperceptible to anyone else, irrevocable to me. I touched the counter with the flat of my hand, grounding myself in the cool stone. The house breathed. The clock in the hall made its practiced, patient sounds. In the guest room a soft thud suggested a book sliding from a bed, or a person turning onto his side. By then, the story that would deliver us to the morning of the phone had already begun to write itself, not in sweeping sentences, but in the simple grammar of proximity, 2 mugs on the same saucer, a shared glance when the oven timer failed to ring, a question hanging in the doorway like a coat waiting for its owner. I did not say yes. I did not say no. I stood at the threshold longer than any polite guest would tolerate and felt the door grow lighter in my hand. On the morning that drew the line, if such days can be said to carry markers, the house put on a different quiet. My husband left earlier than usual with a binder under his arm and an apology tossed over his shoulder about meetings stacking like dishes. The apology was habit more than sentiment. He kissed the air near my cheek and reminded me of the contractor's update that might arrive by noon. The door closed with the soft reluctance of old hinges, and the air relaxed by a fraction. I stood at the kitchen counter, both palms flat on the cool stone, listening to the refrigerator's careful hum and the distant rhythm of a neighbor's rake. Through the window, the guest room curtains lifted slightly, as if nodding to the day. I told myself to move in straight lines, prep vegetables, wipe the stovetop, sort the mail. Instead I drifted. The dining table had a scattering of pencils he'd left from the night before. Their sharpened tips looked like a row of small promises. Beside them lay his sketchbook, closed this time, a strip of paper marking a page. I did not open it. I reshelved a book that had wandered to the console and dusted the frame that held an early photograph from our marriage, my husband laughing into the wind, my hand on his sleeve. There was affection in that image, the kind that lives in the muscle memory of 2 people lifting the same box or folding the same sheet. But there was also a distance I hadn't named back then. Two people looking outward in parallel, the horizon pulling at us like tide. He came into the kitchen with his hair damp from a shower and the energy of someone newly installed in a day. He said he was going to the hardware store to find a better sealant for the back steps. The one he'd used was already losing its grip. I offered to drive. He hesitated, clearly ready to say he could walk, then said, "If you want," and in those 3 words I heard a politeness that did not close the door. I took my cardigan from the back of the chair and realized I had picked the one with the fine ribbing along the cuffs, a detail no one ever comments on, which is precisely why it matters to me. The drive was short, down 2 sunlit streets and a hill that always smells a little of damp leaves. We did not fill the car with words. I noticed how his knees braced lightly when I tapped the brakes, how his gaze flicked from the windshield to the side mirror and back, the attentive choreography of an alert passenger. He carried himself with that supple confidence of someone who trusts his body to do what he asks of it, lifting without strain, bending without creak. At the store he moved among aisles with the candid curiosity that draws clerks to helpfulness. He compared nozzles and tubes, reading the microprint the way some people read omens. I found myself liking his seriousness in small matters. It mirrored the way I fold kitchen towels into precise thirds for no reason other than the calm it lends a drawer. On the way back he pointed out a mural I had never noticed, a burst of color under the railroad bridge, and we slowed so I could actually see it. The figures were abstracted, but there was no ambiguity in their momentum. They leaned forward, as if the future were a door they could shoulder open. "It's been there for months," he said. I accepted the mild reprimand that comes with discovery near home. We drove in silence for a block, and when a light turned red, I felt the impulse to say something that would change nothing and everything. I did not. The light went green. The sun blinked off the windshield of the car ahead like a signal that only I received. Back at the house, the day parted around us. He took the sealant outside. I gathered sheets from the dryer, their warmth clinging to my arms, and carried them to the guest room. The sight of his duffels at the foot of the bed jarred me slightly, not because they were out of place, this was his place for now, but because they were so obviously temporary. Nothing about a duffel bag promises permanence. I set the folded sheets on the chair by the window and was about to leave when I saw a charcoal drawing propped on the desk, the dogwood tree from our yard, rendered with spare, certain lines. The trunk leaned in a way I had not noticed in life. The shadow under it did not look like a patch of shade so much as a question, a soft aperture in the grass. I returned to the hall with the odd sensation that the house had turned its face a few degrees, presenting me a different cheek. We met again at the back steps, where he crouched with the sealant and a rag. He explained briefly, like an aside, why the first bead had failed and how this one would hold. I nodded, absorbing little of the technicality and much of the intention, the wish to leave a thing better than he found it. We stood there like neighbors conferring about weather until the late morning heated the boards enough to press us back into shade. I went inside to make iced tea and found that my hands were unsteady. The clink of glass on counter sounded too loud. I measured sugar by memory and added slices of lemon that released oil into the air, a scent both blunt and clean. We ate lunch shoulder to shoulder at the kitchen island, plates angled toward the same patch of afternoon light as if we had done this 100 times, as if this seating had already been decided long ago by some benign architect. He told a story about a courier who wears a cape on Fridays and delivers packages with a flourish, and I laughed, not at the joke, which was thin, but at the pleasure of sharing the shape of a small absurdity. He asked about the framed print of a coastal town above the sink, and I said we had found it at a street fair on a trip we once took. I did not add that we had argued that morning over nothing, over a late checkout, over a waiter distracted by a busker's saxophone, and that the print had been a peace treaty. Some details belonged to a map I was not ready to hand him. After lunch he returned to the steps. I washed dishes slowly, watching serviceable bubbles build soft peaks that collapsed at the lightest touch. The ordinary rhythm of the kitchen steadied me: rinse, stack, wipe. When I finished, I stood uselessly in the center of the room and listened for some cue from the landscape of the day. It came as a simple invitation. He called from the yard, just my name and the question of whether I wanted to see how neatly the line had set. I did. I stepped into my shoes and crossed the cool tiles, then the warm boards of the back porch, then the warmest planks of the step itself. He pointed to the narrow seam where wood met wood, now sealed as if the gap had never been a problem. There is a private relief in mended things. It marks the place where neglect yields to care. In the late afternoon, the sky clouded over in that particular pattern we get, light breaking through like paper torn by careful hands. We decided to walk to the small market for herbs I had forgotten. The route dipped under the same bridge with the mural. Up close the colors were louder, the brushstrokes more human. A cyclist passed, bell chiming once, twice, and then gone. He kept a pace just slower than mine, the courtesy of someone avoiding the arrogance of leading. When we reached the market, he lingered at the stand with stone fruit, pressing gently to test for ripeness, while I stared too long at a display of basil as if learning to read. The woman at the register complimented my cardigan, and I felt unreasonable gratitude. So little is required to remind a person that they are visible. We carried our light bags home and talked about nothing with the concentration of people crossing a tightrope. Back in the kitchen we washed the basil and left it to dry on a clean dish towel. I put on the radio and found a station playing songs from the year I turned 30. The vocalist's voice was warmer than I remembered, like metal heated gently until it loses its bite. Evening gathered quietly. My husband texted that his meeting had turned into dinner. He told me not to wait up with a thumbs up that felt simultaneously casual and performative, as if approval were the easiest currency to spend. I set the phone face down on the counter and felt time settle around us with a softness that was not innocent. He asked, softly, mindful of the house's acoustics, if I wanted to watch a film. I said yes. In the living room he let me choose, and I picked something older, a film whose dialogue I could almost recite, the cinematic equivalent of an old sweater that still remembers your shoulders. We sat at either end of the couch at first, the space between us wide enough to fit a basket of laundry. The lamps pooled light at our feet. On the screen, two people who had no business becoming tender toward each other learned, slowly, to admit the weather in their chests. We let the story move ahead of us like a cautious guide. At some point the air shifted. It was not dramatic. The shift felt like the house exhaling after holding itself in a formal pose. I realized both of us had leaned forward, elbows on knees, drawn by a quiet scene in which nothing happened except that 2 cups of tea steamed on a table. The camera lingered, generous in its patience. My attention flicked to the reflection in the black glass of the window. We were silhouettes, parallel, balanced. He turned his head first. I felt the movement more than saw it, the whisper of fabric, the slight change in the couch's springs. When I turned, our faces were close enough that I could count the tiny, asymmetrical flecks in his eyes. I registered the rational facts. Someone might walk by outside, the dog 2 houses down had started barking again, the basil would stain the towel if left too long, and then the rational facts lost their volume. We kissed. After, the room returned to its shapes: couch, lamp, stack of books. The film continued without us noticing and then, rudely, announced itself with credits. I stood too quickly, muttered something about tea, and escaped to the kitchen, where the air felt thinner. I gripped the counter a second time that day and waited for the tremor in my hands to subside. In the sink, the basil leaf I had left unfolded itself in the water like a small green hand. I closed my eyes, and the image behind my lids was the impossible ordinariness of his expression in that first instant after our mouths parted: surprise, yes, but also an alertness that looked like honesty. I am not naive about the stories people tell when they want something. I have told a few myself over the years about how contentment is a function of gratitude, about how desire is a young person's confusion. Those stories have their uses. And then they stop fitting. He did not follow me immediately. When he did appear in the doorway, he kept to its edge as if respecting a border I had redrawn. We did not dissect what had happened. We rinsed our glasses. We checked the locks. We turned off lights room by room as if closing a theater after the audience has gone. At the foot of the stairs I felt the urge to apologize to the air, to the framed photographs, to the person I had been diligent about being. The urge passed. I slept in a way that felt like trusting gravity. In the morning, my husband would stand in our kitchen and speak into his phone about schedules and receipts. In some other morning not far off, he would hold my phone in his hands and read the name that made his face change. But that night, the house was a simple machine, boards and pipes and wires behaving as designed. The refrigerator hummed. A car door clicked shut 2 streets over. The basil dried without staining the towel after all. Upstairs, in the guest room, a duffel bag sat zipped impatient, a witness no court would call. I lay in bed and felt my pulse taper towards sleep, aware of the fact that the smallest acts, choosing a cardigan, driving to a store, watching a film, can bend a life with the quiet certainty of water shaping stone. The morning after felt oddly still, as if the house were listening. I moved through the kitchen with deliberate slowness, rinsing fruit, setting the kettle, placing plates with the care of someone performing a routine in front of an invisible audience. My husband had already left, leaving behind the faint trace of his cologne and the empty mug by the sink. The silence he left was the same as always, but it carried a new weight now, layered with the memory of last night's breach. He came down later, hair mussed, eyes clear in a way that made me wonder if he'd slept at all. We exchanged a greeting so ordinary it almost felt dishonest. There was no mention of the kiss, no awkward pause, only the same rhythm of 2 people sharing a kitchen. He reached past me to take a glass from the cupboard, his sleeve brushing my arm lightly. The contact was so brief it could have been nothing. It didn't feel like nothing. The day unfolded in small, careful segments. I busied myself with laundry and phone calls, ensuring there was always some tangible task between us. Still, we crossed paths more than seemed accidental, on the back porch when I stepped out to shake crumbs from the tablecloth, in the hallway when I carried folded towels upstairs, near the garden gate when he was checking the hinges. Each time, our eyes met for a beat too long, the air tightening just enough to register. By mid-afternoon, a list of errands gave us a reason to leave the house together. My husband had asked me to pick up a package from the post office. He offered to come along. I told myself it was purely practical, 2 sets of hands, a short drive, but I noticed how I adjusted my scarf before we stepped outside. The walk from the car to the post office door felt both too short and too long. Inside, the scent of paper and dust and faint perfume from a clerk's wrist wrapped around us. He waited behind me in line, close enough that I could feel the warmth from his coat. Neither of us spoke. On the way back, he pointed out a bakery he'd never tried. I slowed the car almost without thinking, and we ended up inside, standing by a glass case where loaves and pastries sat like small, patient treasures. We chose 2 different kinds of bread, exchanging a glance over the counter as if we'd agreed on more than food. The woman at the register commented on the weather, and I answered automatically, but my thoughts were elsewhere, on the way his fingers brushed mine when he took the paper bag, on how normal it would look to anyone watching. When we returned home, the late winter light had started to stretch shadows across the yard. I carried the bread to the kitchen while he went to the shed for tools. Through the window I watched him check the latch, his movements steady, precise. I realized I was memorizing these small things, as though they would matter later. The kettle clicked off and brought me back to the moment. I poured tea, set out cups, and when he came in, we sat at opposite ends of the table, sipping in a quiet that was not uncomfortable. evening came quickly. My husband texted to say he'd be late, delays at work. I read the message twice, then set the phone down without replying immediately. Across from me, he was leafing through a newspaper, though I could tell he wasn't reading it. We spoke only about dinner, deciding on something simple. The air between us held a tension that was neither hostile nor benign, only charged, like the moment before a curtain rises. Later, when the dishes were done and the lights in the living room cast a soft, low glow, I realized the day had passed without any open acknowledgement of what had changed. Yet everything felt rearranged, as if an invisible line had shifted under our feet. We moved around each other with the same practiced ease, but now every gesture carried a question. I could feel it in the way he stood just far enough to give me space, and in the way I noticed every time he entered a room. That night, lying in bed before my husband returned, I listened to the faint creak of the guest room floorboards. The sound was nothing unusual, but it reached me differently. I stared at the ceiling, aware of my own breathing, of the quiet hum of the house, of the fact that something had begun and we had both silently agreed not to name it yet. The following days settled into a pattern that looked, from the outside, like calm. My husband's schedule kept him away for long hours, and the house became a quieter place where tasks unfolded without interruption. I told myself that the rhythm was good for me, that the long stretches of silence gave me space to think, but in truth, I noticed how each sound took on new meaning. The thud of a cupboard, the creak of the stairs, the muffled scrape of a chair against the floor, these small noises mapped his presence without my needing to see him. On the third afternoon, the garden became the setting for our shared work. I had gone outside to cut back the last of the winter-damaged branches when he appeared at the edge of the yard, gloves in one hand and a determined expression on his face. Without a word, he took the shears from me and began trimming the heavier limbs, his movements efficient, deliberate. I watched for a moment before kneeling to gather fallen twigs into a basket. The air was crisp, the light filtered through thin clouds, and in that small corner of the world, we worked side by side as though we had always done so. There were pauses. Sometimes he would straighten, stretch his back, and glance in my direction before returning to the task. Once, as I bent to pick up a branch, our hands met briefly on the handle of the basket. The contact was unremarkable in action, but not in feeling. It lingered in the air between us even after we stepped apart. I focused on the neat rows of cut stems, on the way the garden was beginning to look orderly again, as if that could steady the pulse that had quickened without my permission. The neighbor's voice broke the moment. She had come to the fence, leaning casually on the top rail, her eyes flicking between us. We exchanged the usual greetings, but I caught the trace of curiosity in her gaze. She asked about the plants, the weather, whether my husband had mentioned the upcoming community meeting. Her tone was light, but there was a measured quality to her pauses. After she left, the space she'd occupied seemed to hold the faint echo of her questions. We worked a little longer in silence before carrying the tools back to the shed. Inside, the air smelled of wood and metal, a mix of stored rakes, old paint, and the faint sweetness of soil still clinging to pots. He set the shears on their hook, brushing past me in the narrow space. The closeness was brief but enough to sharpen my awareness of it. When we stepped out, the sun had dipped lower, throwing long shadows across the grass. Back in the kitchen, I began to prepare dinner, moving with the automatic motions of peeling, chopping, stirring. He lingered at the counter, offering to help, though I waved him off with a smile that felt steadier than I expected. Still, I could sense his presence just behind me as I reached for the spice rack, his shadow joining mine on the tiled wall. We didn't speak of the afternoon, but it was there, folded quietly into the background of the meal. When my husband returned later that evening, his mood was lighter than usual, his conversation full of small details from his day. I listened, asked the right questions, and moved dishes from counter to table in time with the rise and fall of his voice. Across from me, the young man ate quietly, contributing a comment now and then, his tone measured. The conversation wove around him without pulling him in completely, and I wondered if my husband noticed. If he did, he didn't let on. That night, when the house had settled into its familiar quiet, I thought again of the neighbor at the fence, of her eyes lingering just a second too long, of the possibility that she had seen something neither of us had said aloud. I lay in bed with that thought, listening to the steady hum of the heating system and the distant creak of the guest room floorboards, aware that what had begun as unspoken had already found a way to be seen. The rain arrived before dawn, steady and unhurried, the kind that softens the edges of the day. By the time I came downstairs, the windows were blurred with droplets and the yard lay under a fine mist. My husband had left early again, a note on the counter reminding me to confirm a delivery. The quiet was deep, the kind that fills the house in layers, each room holding its own hush. I moved through the morning slowly, making coffee and watching the pale light shift across the kitchen tiles. He appeared in the doorway without a sound, hair slightly damp from the shower, a sweater loose over his shoulders. We exchanged the kind of good morning that feels both routine and careful, then went about our separate tasks. He sorted through some papers at the table while I gathered laundry from the dryer. Yet every movement felt aware of the other's presence, as if the air carried a shared undercurrent. By late morning the rain grew heavier, drumming softly on the roof. The electricity flickered once and then went out entirely, leaving the house in a dim, muted light. I lit a few candles in the kitchen and set a kettle on the gas stove. The faint scent of match smoke lingered as I sliced bread for lunch. He came to stand beside me, offering to help, and together we worked in the narrow space, our elbows nearly touching. The rhythm of small tasks, passing a plate, pouring water, seemed to move without instruction. When the meal was ready, we sat at the table, the candlelight casting shadows that shifted with each flicker. The conversation began lightly, circling around the weather and the power outage, but soon slipped into quieter territory. We spoke about plans not yet made, about the kind of places one might visit simply for the air, the way certain streets feel different under rain. There was no rush in the words, only the slow turning of thoughts between us. At some point, there was a pause. The house seemed to lean into it, holding still. He looked at me for a moment longer than necessary, and in that space, without prelude or further thought, we kissed. The moment was unadorned, stripped of anything but its own immediacy. When we parted, there was no scramble to explain, no startled apology. Only the sound of rain on the windows and the faint hiss of the cooling kettle. We cleared the table in silence, each movement precise, as though we had agreed on an unspoken order. The candles burned lower. Outside, the garden blurred into shapes, the colors deepened by the rain. The electricity returned with a click and a hum, but we did not rush to switch on the lights. The soft, dim glow seemed more fitting. By evening, the rain had eased to a mist. My husband returned later than usual, shaking water from his coat, his voice carrying the briskness of a day filled with errands and deadlines. I moved through the motions of dinner, setting plates, refilling glasses, all while aware of the weight of the earlier hours. Across the table, the young man met my eyes only in passing, each glance brief but steady. That night, as the house settled, I lay awake listening to the faint patter of water still dripping from the eaves. The quiet was different now, no longer the stillness of an untouched room, but the charged pause after something has been set in motion. It was a silence I could feel in my bones, certain it would not remain unbroken for long. The morning after the rain broke into a pale, almost tentative sunlight. The ground was still soft, and the air carried that faint mineral scent that comes when water lingers in the soil. My husband left with his usual quickness, the sound of his car fading down the street before I had even finished my coffee. The house, once again, belonged to its quieter occupants. I decided to walk into town for a few small errands. He was already in the kitchen when I mentioned it, pouring himself tea. Without hesitation, He said he would come too, claiming he needed to pick up something from the art supply store. There was no reason to refuse. We left together, the morning cool enough for scarves, the sidewalks shining in patches where puddles still caught the light. The walk began with practical talk, items to remember, the quickest route, but soon eased into stretches of companionable silence. I noticed the way he adjusted his pace to match mine, slowing at the curb, quickening where the pavement was clear. Near the center of town, the streets were busier, but not enough to drown out the occasional sound of our footsteps falling in sync. We reached the small market first. I gathered the vegetables I needed while he disappeared briefly into another aisle, returning with a roll of paper tucked under his arm. When the errands were done, he suggested stopping by the gallery 2 streets over. I hadn't been there in years, but the idea seemed harmless. Inside, the air smelled faintly of varnish and old wood. The rooms were quiet, just a few visitors moving slowly from one piece to the next. We didn't linger together. He moved toward a series of sketches while I stood before a large landscape, tracing the brushstrokes with my eyes. Yet somehow, I was always aware of where he stood, as if my senses had learned to track him without looking. In the final room, he was leaning over a display case of small ink drawings. I joined him, and we spoke in low voices about the work. It wasn't just the art, it was the simple act of sharing the same frame of view, of having our attention pulled by the same lines on the page. When we left, the sunlight had grown warmer, and the air felt looser, as if the day had opened a little more. We stopped for coffee before heading home. The cafe was nearly empty, the sound of the grinder and the soft clink of cups filling the space between our words. Sitting across from him at a small table, I was struck by how ordinary it all must have looked, 2 people resting after errands, while knowing it didn't feel ordinary at all. Every gesture, every pause, seemed to hold more than it showed. The walk back was quieter. The streets near home were lined with trees beginning to bud, a pale green haze along the branches. As we turned onto our street, I caught sight of the neighbor in her yard. She raised a hand in greeting, her eyes moving from him to me and back again before she smiled. It was the kind of smile that could mean nothing, or everything, depending on what one wanted to see. Inside, we unpacked the groceries without speaking much. He carried his supplies upstairs while I put the vegetables in their places. The day slipped into its usual rhythm, the house filling with the muted sounds of our separate activities. Yet the memory of the walk, the gallery, the quiet coffee lingered, like a thread laid loosely across the hours. By evening, my husband was home, tired but in good spirits. He spoke at length about his day over dinner, and I played my part in the conversation, asking questions, nodding in the right places. Across the table, the young man listened quietly, offering the occasional remark. Nothing in the exchange gave anything away, yet I knew that today had carved another small, deliberate mark into the unspoken ledger between us. When the house settled into night, I lay in bed, replaying the simple images of the day, the sound of our steps on wet pavement, the soft light in the gallery, the way the neighbor's gaze lingered. None of it was dramatic, but each detail felt like a stone laid on a path I was already walking, whether or not I had decided where it led. The house felt unusually warm that evening, the kind of warmth that comes from still air and the lingering heat of the day. My husband had left for an overnight trip, his suitcase in the trunk before breakfast, a list of things for me to keep an eye on while he was away. The absence of his voice, his footsteps, his quiet routines left a space that seemed to expand as the hours passed. We spent the early part of the evening in the kitchen, making a simple meal. The radio was on low, the hum of a voice between songs filling the pauses in our conversation. We moved easily around each other, passing plates and utensils without thought. There was an ease to it that felt both familiar and strange, as if the rhythm belonged to a version of life I hadn't known I'd been missing. After dinner, we cleared the table together, stacking plates, wiping surfaces. The small sounds, the scrape of ceramic, the faint splash of water, stood out in the otherwise quiet house. The television in the living room was off, the curtains already drawn against the deepening dark. Without much discussion, we settled there, the lamplight soft against the furniture, a faint scent of rain drifting through the open window. We talked for a while about ordinary things, the repairs he was still helping with, a film he had seen recently, the neighbor's habit of leaving her porch light on until morning. The conversation slowed until it became a kind of shared silence, not empty but charged with a quiet awareness. I noticed the way his hand rested on the arm of the chair, his fingers still, his gaze steady. The moment felt like the edge of a choice, one neither of us spoke aloud. I don't know if we both knew where it would lead, or if we simply followed the pull of the unspoken. There was no build-up, no long pause. We spent the night together. It was stated only in the language of presence, in the unbroken stretch of time that belonged entirely to us. Morning came softly, the light muted by thin clouds. I woke with the sense that the air had shifted, that the quiet in the house was different now. Downstairs, the kettle whistled, and the scent of toast reached me before I left the bedroom. He was already at the table when I entered, the newspaper folded beside his plate. We exchanged a greeting as if nothing had changed, as if the hours between evening and morning had been ordinary. We moved through the day with that same surface calm. He worked in the yard for a while, I answered emails and made a list for the week ahead. Every so often our paths crossed, a brief word in the hallway, the passing of a mug of tea, but there was no reference to the night before. Still, it sat between us, a quiet certainty that didn't need to be named. When my husband returned in the late afternoon, the house resumed its usual shape. He spoke about the trip, the meetings, the traffic on the way back. I listened, nodding at the right moments, my voice steady, my hands moving through familiar motions. Across the room, the young man was tidying the counter, his expression unreadable. That evening, as I lay in bed, I thought about how quickly something new can become part of the ordinary. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic turn, only the knowledge that a line had been crossed, and that nothing in the quiet of the house could erase it. In the days that followed, the house seemed to fall back into its usual rhythm, at least on the surface. My husband's work kept him busy, leaving early and returning late, his attention pulled by phone calls and schedules. There was no sign that anything in his perception had shifted. If he sensed changes in the air, he gave no indication. That quiet made it both easier and harder to move through the days. The young man and I kept our interactions within the bounds of practicality whenever my husband was present. We spoke about repairs, groceries, the weather, never more. Yet even the most ordinary exchanges seemed to carry an undertone that I felt in the space between words. A look held a fraction longer, a tone weighted with something unspoken, the way two people might acknowledge a secret in the briefest glance. One afternoon, I stepped outside to tend to the garden. The light was thin, the air mild enough for working without a jacket. I trimmed back the last of the winter damage from the roses and cleared away the leaves that had gathered along the fence. I heard the shed door open behind me, and when I turned, he was there with a rake over his shoulder, asking if I needed help. We worked in parallel, the scrape of metal tines against the ground filling the silence. Occasionally our paths crossed as we moved tools or gathered piles of debris, and each time, there was that subtle pause, that flicker of recognition before the rhythm of work resumed. Midway through the task, I noticed movement at the edge of the yard. The neighbor was standing just beyond the fence, her dog sniffing at the grass. She greeted us warmly, making small talk about the weather, but her eyes lingered on the scene in a way that made me aware of the distance, or lack of it, between us as we worked. It was the same kind of glance she'd given before, casual in delivery but deliberate in its weight. After she left, I felt the trace of her presence in the air, as though her attention had left an imprint. Later, in the kitchen, I put water on to boil for tea. He came in quietly, setting the rake against the wall before washing his hands at the sink. The light was low, the sun slipping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the counter. We didn't speak, but the silence felt steady, not strained. When the kettle whistled, I poured 2 cups without asking, sliding one across to him. He took it with a nod, and for a moment, the scene felt almost like any other, 2 people sharing a pause in the day, yet I knew it wasn't the same. That evening my husband returned in unusually good spirits, recounting a small success at work. The 3 of us sat in the living room for a while, the conversation staying light, drifting from topic to topic. I listened carefully to his voice, to any shift in his tone that might suggest suspicion, but found none. If anything, he seemed more relaxed than usual, unaware of the quiet undercurrent threading through the room. When the house settled into its night routine, I found myself lying awake, the day playing back in my mind in fragments, the scrape of the rake, the neighbor's gaze, the quiet tea in the fading light. None of it was remarkable on its own, yet together it felt like part of a slow, deliberate drift towards something that could not be undone. The space between what was said and what was understood seemed to grow wider with each passing day, and I knew we were both walking that line, step for careful step. The week began without any disruption, yet each day seemed to tighten an invisible thread. My husband's focus remained on his own concerns, deadlines, meetings, the endless cycle of calls and emails. He left early on Tuesday morning for a short business trip, a detail he mentioned only in passing the night before. His absence was planned, but the reality of it settled over the house like a shift in the weather. The first morning alone felt unhurried. I made breakfast without the usual background noise of his movements upstairs. The young man joined me in the kitchen, his steps quiet, his expression neutral but not distant. We spoke about practical matters, groceries to pick up, a bill that had arrived in the mail. The conversation stayed safely in that territory, yet the pauses carried a weight that didn't exist before. By midday, the sky had clouded over, and the air pressed with the heaviness before rain. I suggested driving into town to pick up what we needed from the market before the weather turned. He agreed, and we left together. The drive was quiet at first, the hum of the engine filling the space between us. As we reached the outskirts of town, the first drops began to hit the windshield, streaking downward in slow, uneven lines. Inside the market, we moved through the aisles with unspoken coordination. He carried the heavier items without being asked, placing them into the cart with a care that drew my attention more than it should have. At the register, the clerk made a casual remark about the storm rolling in, and I felt a flicker of relief at the interruption of my thoughts. The rain intensified on the drive back. Water drummed on the roof, the wipers keeping a steady rhythm. At one intersection, we had to wait longer than usual for the light to change. I noticed his gaze shift toward me briefly before returning to the road ahead. It was nothing that could be named, yet it stayed with me as we pulled into the driveway. Back at the house, we worked together to put away the groceries. The wind had picked up, rattling the branches outside, and the lights flickered once. I lit a lamp in the kitchen just in case. He lingered for a moment after the last bag was emptied, standing at the counter as if weighing whether to say something. Instead, he simply nodded before leaving the room. The afternoon stretched into a long, quiet sequence of tasks, sorting laundry, checking messages, preparing ingredients for dinner. I could hear him upstairs, the faint sounds of movement carrying down the hall. Once, I passed the guest room on my way to the linen closet and found the door slightly ajar. He was seated at the desk, sketching. He looked up briefly, offered a small, wordless smile, then returned to his work. I closed the door softly and walked on. By the time evening came, the storm was in full force. Rain lashed the windows, and the gutters overflowed in thin streams. The house felt enclosed, its walls holding in a mix of warmth and tension. We ate in the dining room, the table lit by the low glow of a single lamp. Conversation was minimal, broken by the sound of the wind pushing against the siding. It was not an uncomfortable silence, but one that felt deliberate, as though both of us were avoiding certain edges. After the meal, I washed the dishes while he dried them, our movements quiet and efficient. When the kitchen was in order, we drifted into separate rooms without arrangement. The rest of the evening passed in that pattern, shared spaces, brief exchanges, no unnecessary words. Before bed, I checked the locks and glanced out into the dark yard. The rain was easing, though the air still smelled of wet earth and wood. Upstairs, the sound of his footsteps crossing the hallway reminded me that, for now, the balance we were keeping held. But I knew it was a balance that could tip with the smallest shift, and perhaps it already had. The morning after the storm felt washed clean, the air crisp with the scent of damp leaves and earth. Sunlight fell in narrow stripes across the kitchen floor, cutting through the coolness that lingered in the house. My husband had returned late the previous night from his trip, and his presence was immediately visible, his suitcase left by the stairs, his jacket draped over the back of a chair. He was already gone again when I came downstairs, leaving behind only a half-empty coffee cup and the faintest trace of his cologne. I made tea, moving through the kitchen with a deliberate calm. The young man came in a few minutes later, hair still slightly disheveled from sleep. We exchanged quiet greetings, both of us aware of my husband's absence but not addressing it. We went about our separate tasks, the sound of the kettle and the soft clink of dishes filling the space between us. By mid-morning, I decided to sort through a stack of old paperwork in the study. The sunlight there was bright enough to work without a lamp, and the open window carried in a light breeze. I lost track of time in the methodical process of sorting, discarding, and filing. At some point, I heard him moving around in the hallway, the steady rhythm of his steps passing the doorway and then fading toward the back of the house. When I took a break and stepped outside, I found him repairing the latch on the garden gate. He was focused on the task, hands steady, the faint sound of metal against wood punctuating the quiet. I asked if he needed anything, and he shook his head with a brief smile. There was nothing in the exchange that anyone else would have noticed, but I carried the image with me as I returned inside, the concentration in his expression, the way the sunlight caught in his hair. The rest of the day unfolded without disruption. My husband returned in the early afternoon, earlier than expected, his mood unreadable but not openly tense. He asked about the house, the storm, the errands, his questions casual. I answered easily, my voice even, my hands busy with preparing coffee. The young man was in the living room, flipping through a book, saying little. The air felt balanced, though I could sense an unspoken awareness threading through the quiet. It was during dinner that the shift came. My husband set down his fork, looked at me across the table, and said, almost conversationally, that he had known for some time about what had been happening. The words were plain, unadorned, but they carried the weight of certainty. Before I could respond, he added that it didn't matter, because he, too, had someone else. His tone held no anger, only a strange calm, as though he were describing the resolution of a long-standing arrangement. I sat still, the edges of the moment sharp in my awareness. He explained briefly that there was no intention of ending our marriage, that we could continue as we were. His eyes met mine steadily, not searching for agreement, but stating the terms of an unspoken contract. Across the table, the young man didn't move, his posture fixed, his gaze on his plate. When the conversation ended, it was as if nothing had been said. We finished the meal in silence, cleared the table, washed the dishes. The house settled into its evening routine with the same measured pace it had always known. Yet I felt the difference in every corner, in the way the walls seemed to stand a fraction further apart, in the absence of a certain kind of tension. Later, as I sat alone in the living room, I thought about the quiet my husband had chosen to keep all this time. It was not forgiveness, not acceptance, but something else entirely, a coexistence built on parallel lives. It was a freedom that felt colder than I had imagined, carrying with it the knowledge that the boundaries I thought I had crossed were, to him, irrelevant. Upstairs, I heard footsteps moving from one room to another. The sound was steady, unhurried. The house was as it had been, yet I knew we were all standing in a different arrangement now, each of us aware of the lines we would not erase.